Our museums empty their beauty. Our museums empty their beauty. About suffering, they were never wrong. The old prophets, how well they understood Mashiach Allah, how it takes the form of fear and hunger and loss and poverty and lives and crops. How, wherever Arabs passionately await the miracle of democracy, there always must be colonizers who do not especially want it to happen, creating and disarming bombs at the edge of their Zion. They never forgot that even the dreadful martyrdom must run its course somewhere in the desert. Someone's country where invasions proceed, puppet regimes, and torture houses set up innocently behind classrooms. Torture houses set up innocently behind classrooms. In America's Iraq, for instance, how everyone turns away quite leisurely from their disaster. The foreigner may have heard the explosion, the mother's cry, but for him it is not an important failure. The sun shines as it has to on the camouflage disappearing into the green zone, and the expensive, delicate convoys, who must have heard something amazing, a boy falling into the sky, have somewhere to get to, and sail calmly on. To Allah we belong, and to Him is our return. So what is this about? Our museums empty their beauty. I believe this is a W.H. Auden poem I got from one of my poetry surveys, and I did an interpretation of that. Syntactical interpretation. W.H. Auden, is that his name? And then we're going to do Icarus, and the subject of his poem, he was looking at a classical, so this is heavily steeped in the Western canon. Musée des Beaux-Arts was his poem. This is the only one I'm going to actually read the original as well. About suffering, they were never wrong, the old masters. How well they understood its human position, how it takes place while someone else is eating or opening a window or... Fucking A, this one doesn't even have the full text of the poem. That's a fucking waste. Come on. Look at this. Why can you find any major poem on the internet for free? Because when it comes to culture, and if it's of value, we don't hoard it, we share it, because we know that it offers human edification and it opens up our heart and our identity and who we are. Disney pushes Mickey Mouse further and further into a copyright, because that's, is it culture or is that just power and money hoarding? It's just business. So there's, in all of history and all of culture, on one side, the human side, trying to safeguard what it means to be human, and on the other side, the power side, just trying to push emotional triggers in order to monetize expression. The internet sides with one over the other pretty obviously, which is why you can download most movies for free. It's people, so the dominant culture is trying to claim that intellectual property is actual property and treat it as such. That's not how the internet feels, and that's not how the younger generations feel, although they try to brainwash into feeling that way. Which is why my publishing company will always allow this stuff for free online. We try to stay ahead of the curve. But about suffering, they were never wrong, the old masters. How well they understood its human position. How it takes place while someone else is eating or opening a window, or just watching dully along. How when the aged are reverently, passionately waiting for the miraculous birth, there always must be children who did not specially want it to happen, skating on a pond at the edge of the wood. They never forgot that even the dreadful martyrdom must run its course. See, so that line I actually kept. I kept a lot of the original lines on this. Anyhow, in a corner, some untidy spot where the dogs go with their doggy life, and the torturer's horse scratches its innocent behind a tree. In Bruegel's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away quite leisurely from the disaster. The plowman may have heard the splash, the forsaken cry, but for him it was not an important failure. The sun shone as it had on the white legs disappearing into the green water, as the expensive, delicate ship that must have seen something amazing, a boy falling out of the sky, had somewhere to get to and sailed calmly on. So I probably copied at least 50% of the poem. And this is the cleverness in my mind, thinking, all right, A part of the genocide is the fact that their museums and their history and culture, that's what genocide is destroying the story of a people. Not just destroying the people, but purposefully destroying their identity. So by us allowing their museums to be raided, the culture of Iraq is being assaulted. Not just their natural resources, but and some of those artifacts are finding themselves in private collectors' hands in the West. When you go after someone's natural resources, it's imperial invasion. But when you raid their culture, then, well, that's a case for genocide. So that bugged me. So, and then I take the Western canon, the supposed master of the canon, who what he's doing is he's looking at this picture, which I will, yeah. This is a picture. So this is a form of poetry like Ode to a Grecian Urn. Well, you take something, a classical piece, and then you meditate on it. So that's his classical picture that he's meditating on. And then if you look in the corner right here, let me see if I can find it. Boom. Those legs falling into the water next to that expensive ship, that's Icarus. So he's looking at this picture of Icarus, and he's noticing the composition, how you have the whole idyllic scene and the tragedy, and that's the conceit is like the clever thing. That's the conceit of that artistic piece, the painting, which is it's called The Fall of Icarus by Peter Bruegel. And you have this idyllic scene and then this little tragedy in the corner. What a clever way to describe the fall of Icarus as just something people didn't even pay attention to. It's a different lens to look at this myth. Now, Auden comments on it about suffering. They weren't wrong, the old masters, the painter of this poem, of this picture, how they understand its human position. So that's his thesis at the beginning, which is what I liked about college, analyzing poetry, like law. We're making our case for our interpretation of what the poem means. At the very beginning, he says his position. He states his position, and then he defends it. And he has some supporting clauses at the very end, which are interesting. So suffering, Icarus, tragedy, the downfall of hubris. He flew too close to the sun. He was warned, and he still did it. Now, the position of that suffering, he says, in the masters were correct, that it's often ignored. Dreadful martyrdom must run its course. Suffering is just a part of human nature. And then, so that's the first stanza is all about that. And then the second, he brings up the picture specifically, the painting specifically. In Bruegel's Icarus, for instance, I think I'm saying that right. Bruegel, how everything turns away quite leisurely from the disaster. So in this, I saw a guy saying how commonplace suffering was, and then also how people ignore it, tragedy, which reading through, I'll open up my poem book of poetry, the Western canon, glance through. I had a couple really good ones. I had one, if I had to think about my favorite books in my life, there was one that was edited. So if you want to find a good survey book, you want to find a good editor. So you find someone who really loves the subject. And then if they put it together, it'll be interesting to see what they picked out. And T.S. Merwin was an American poet laureate. So he put out a book of American poetry. Not American, because this guy is British, I think. But a book of poetry. I guess Western poetry. No, because he had foreign poetry in there too, I think. I'd have to look up that book. But it was a really cool survey book of poetry from all over. So that's where I found this one. Because I looked up usually that's what I like about Toynbee. I don't think he got everything right about civilization, but he flipped positions on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, supporting Israel and then supporting Palestine, and he did a couple other things that I thought showed intellectual honesty. He would revise his position when presented with new information. So it's not that my heroes are always right, and I definitely don't want them to be always wrong. I want them to be critical thinkers, because that's all I ask of myself. I said earlier in these videos, honesty and sincerity seem to correct towards the truth. So if you're honestly and sincerely wrong when new information is proposed to you and you're using your critical thinking, you should be able to change your position. Chalmers Johnson is a guy who's critical of the American empire, And people ask him, you used to be in the Reagan administration. Why should we listen to you? You were a warmonger. And he just admits that he didn't know enough about the world or Americans' true role. Some of these guys who work in these administrations haven't really questioned intelligence agencies or the CIA's role. And what's scary is that uh, our administration seems to be hiring more and more people who are drinking the Kool-Aid, who are yes men, and less people who are critical thinkers. So who did George Bush Jr. bring in? He brought in all the cronies who perpetrated the atrocities in Latin America. The what's his name? The guy who perjured himself, who almost went to jail. The You just look up. Almost everyone in George Bush's administration was either a apologist for empire, an active perpetrator of empire, or a crony lobbyist making a war profiteer. That's pretty much the three categories. The apologists who make up false narratives in order to apologize for power and its inhuman devastation. Um, the active perpetrators of the crimes of empire, or people who profit from it. Dick Cheney profits from it. Donald Rumsfeld, an active architect of the Vietnam War and our imperial crimes. He's a lifelong bureaucrat. Um, let's see, who else? What's this guy's name? Iran-Contra affair. He almost went down, but I guess he didn't for some reason. Maybe he was pardoned by the president, but he was indicted. Um, but yeah, so I have all this stuff swirling around in my head. Our museums empty their beauty. So again, this is from the perspective of an Iraqi. Uh, in order to offer healing, we're trying to put ourselves in their position. How would we feel if we were having this genocide inflicted against us? About suffering, they were never wrong. He's not coming from the Western canon, of course. So then I found this term, Mashiat Ali. What does that mean? It reminded me a lot, I grew up conservative Christian, long-suffering. Why is long-suffering a fruit of the Spirit? The fruits of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, strength. I forget. I knew a lot of Bible growing up. And a spiritual, that allows people of faith in order to endure, which is why it's important to have faith, because life can become unendurable. And if you don't have a bedrock that goes beyond reason, like faith, then when life is unreasonably hard sometimes, you can become despondent to the point of giving up. So why not give yourself a way to endure what is sometimes irrational? And that's the power of faith. That's why when I walk away from Christianity, I don't lose my spirituality. I just feel like my God has become nameless and my religion has become love. That's what love is, my religion concept, the hippie shit. It's like, if there's one person going to hell, I want to be with that one person. I want to be the person who loves enough that I don't want to lose any of our human brethren, the person who tries to understand the most violent, the most crazy among us. It takes a lot of compassion and it takes a lot of self-constraint, because when you believe and you try to love that strongly, you have to hold yourself back from setting yourself on fire in order to heat the world. So that's a really good term when people... Kurt Vonnegut has another term for that, and that's why when I talk about data or technology and the infinite, it's important to have a conception of the infinite. The infinite in terms of spirituality is God. The infinite in terms of data is just understanding that these problems, when you're dealing with computers, can quickly outpace your patience or ability to deal with them. Infinite suffering, stuff like that. So these concepts like long suffering are important. Concepts like God, even. So what's nice is when you read about the history of God, I feel like I actually have a better version of Christianity than the Christians do. That's something I actually respect about Islam, is we're not supposed to have names or images of our highest deity, because that feeds into human ego. If you go back to old Judaism, they believe the same thing. Seems like these monotheists knew from the beginning that once you put images and names on things, it becomes less sacred, and we're supposed to be describing the unknowable, that infinite being, that infinite force. Once you make it smaller than the highest miracle of miracles, it becomes a totem, which people could then wield against each other. So I think that's the beginning of the curses of monotheism, language, capturing it in language as opposed to keeping it ineffable beyond description. If you're going to have a faith, if you keep it in that category, it seems like you get the good without getting the bad. So you don't want to have violence against people who then put names or images on it. That's kind of the wrong interpretation. So is like if you look in the Bible and you think it justifies you handling snakes or poisons. What is that? Somewhere in Mark 8, is it? There's some weird verses that were probably added to the Bible later. I read a book recently which tells you about what parts of the Bible might be the most ludicrous and might not actually have been in the original versions. It's interesting, but anyways, we're not going to talk about the Bible. What we're talking about. I was going to look up Mashiach Allah. I have to look that up. I tried to look it up. Mashiach Allah. Why does Allah allow suffering and evil in the world? So this is, when I looked it up, I realized, oh, this is the Muslim version of long suffering. And people might think this is, like, there's some things in the Bible I really disagree with, like Romans 13, which tells you should pay your taxes and shut the fuck up and just listen to the government. That was probably put in by authoritarian figures in order to get people just to shut the fuck up, pay their taxes, and listen to the government. But when people say turn the other cheek, is maybe put in there by authority figures in order to make them passive, that's a pretty good way to live. You don't want to be completely nonviolent, and Jesus beat the money changers on the steps. So not everything Jesus said seems to be, at least as what he was recorded as saying, seems to be followable. It's not nice when he condemns people to hell for not believing in him. That seems like a little bit of asshole Jesus poking out. But compassion, being able to withstand the anger of others, and long suffering seem to be useful lifetime characteristics. And then the Islam version of that is Mashiach Allah, being able to suffer. Here you go. Dr. Muzammil Siddiqui, Director of the Islamic Society of Orange County, President of the Islamic Society of North America. Indeed, Allah is all-powerful, Al-Aziz, and He is able to do all things. Ala kul shayin qadir. The Quran has mentioned in this hundreds of times. It also mentioned in the Quran that Allah is the creator and He is the best creator. Glory be to Allah, the best creator. Al-Mu'minun. But then the question comes, why do pain and suffering exist in the world? We find sickness, blah, blah, blah. We know this is not the whole story. Besides these negative things, we also see beauty, health, prosperity. But then the question is, why does Allah allow these exceptions? And then he goes into, the Quran tells us that good, evil, and whatever happens in this world happens by Allah's will. Mashiach Allah. So Mashiach Allah is Allah's will. So that's how I related the Western tradition about suffering. They were never wrong. It seems like W.H. Auden was talking about long suffering and about how in the real world suffering will exist side by side with this idyllic painting, trying to explain the conceit of this painting. And I just translated it to a Muslim in Iraq's perspective of how are they able to endure. Like, you look at how many people join the insurgency and you look at how many suicide bombs are going on and how much terrorist attacks are happening against Americans. You could say this is barbarism and animalistic and these people are denying their humanity and there's no defense. Or when you actually look at the historic record of how much they're suffering, you can ask, why isn't it happening more? Why aren't there more terrorist attacks, and why aren't there more people? Why aren't 100% of the Iraqis resisting our invasion? And it's because of this, because there are some people who don't, the people who are trying to self-correct Islam and saying that we have to manage it ourselves, just like us Americans have to manage our radical Christians ourselves. George Bush Jr. has a really weird form of Christianity where he quotes the Bible and end of times and stuff. So we got to rein in the crazies. We don't really have a pot to, what do you call that? We have a pretty glass house to be throwing stones from. Our fundamentalists are pretty bad compared to their fundamentalists, and there's an argument to be made that our fundamentalists cost more global destruction than theirs, because our fundamentalists are in charge of the largest army the world has ever seen, nuclear arsenal. But and that's the nice thing about Donald Trump. He doesn't seem to be a fundamentalist. He just seems to be a dumbass. So what's worse, the insane guy who actually believes in end of times, or the idiot who's just pretending to be the insane guy who believes in the end of times? I'd rather get into a debate with an idiot than an insane person. And I think it's clinically insane to actually believe in the end of times. So, but that's a discussion for another time. So the old prophets, how well they understood the will of Allah, basically, how it takes a form of fear. So if you have this long-suffering view of faith, it allows you to endure these things without becoming retributively violent, which I would argue allows you to retain your civilized nature, which I define civilization as not taking justice into your own hands, but allowing society to have its say in justice, like Raid and Jarar, these people who still are holding out for us to bring these war criminals to justice, which I believe we can. There is a path to justice, and perhaps like a Truth and Reconciliation Committee for Iraq to salvage that nation and its people's sovereignty while salvaging the dignity of America. But that would come from putting their victims of this war of aggression alongside our victims, which are in the military, who were tricked into this war of aggression. But it's going to be a complicated discussion. The only question on whether that'll happen, it will hinge on whether we have the space to have that discussion, or whether that space will be corrupted through these emotional triggers, through the people from without trying to instigate this cultural war, East versus West, and the political brokers trying to preserve their positions of power within our political hierarchy. But if we can, and that's why I feel the male energy is if we can push them out enough to create a space for a rational discussion based on the historic record and based on human values, that's what that discussion would look like. It'd be a Truth and Reconciliation Committee about the devastation we've caused in Iraq in order to help those people reclaim their sovereignty, help us do a logical withdrawal, which wouldn't decrease their security. You do need people to secure national borders, and you do have pressure from without. If we back out, there's a power vacuum. We've seen that. And there are predatory forces from without trying to get into that country. And then a way to do it in which we don't further impugn the honor of our fighting force, which has already been attacked by tricking them into this war of aggression and forcing them to perform dishonorable acts. Is it forcing? It's when the culture comes top down in such a negative way. That's a question for like maybe the behavioral psychologists and other stuff. Like we could look at history. How much do we blame the rank and file German soldiers during the Holocaust, and how much did we blame the culture coming from the top down? Because we can look at psychological experiments where the inducement to follow orders from authority is very high, and something like 90% of people will follow those orders to the point of inflicting pain on others if they don't see other alternatives. We're very conformist, and we're only more so since, we're more so, I don't know, that's like culture, that's historic relativism. That psychological, what I just read in this book about authoritarianism, that psychological experiment was done in the 60s where they found out just how far people would go just following blind orders, inflicting pain on another subject of the experiment just because they were told to do so. And it was surprising that most people would, by a large margin. It was like up to 90% would inflict pain on someone else if they were told to do so. They wouldn't stop orders. So there's a lot of psychological incentive to follow this culture set from the top down, and that's why the chain of command at the top has to be held accountable. But that's how I see justice being reestablished in the world. It's funny that someone who calls himself a barbarian cares so much about salvaging civilization, but I guess that's why I call myself a barbarian, because whatever civilization calls itself right now, it's not civilized. It's a predatory cycle of violence and abuse. So I don't want to identify with that, and with the idea of like Hegelian dialectic to borrow Western civilization's terms from its canon of philosophy. In order to establish truth, you need thesis and antithesis sometimes. So whatever civilization calls itself, if it calls itself civilization, then I'm the barbarian. But whatever it is, I'm not, because I don't see that this is. It's like if we were in the colonies right now, I'd be the guy running to the Indians. So that's, I guess, the territory I'm trying to stake out. Whatever this thing is that we claim that we're a part of doesn't seem very human. So I'm just trying to find distance to form an objective opinion. And I've created an identity in order to do that. Literally living this identity, which is a rejection of the pattern from which I came, in order to see that pattern more clearly. Not in order to attack that pattern, at least not physically, but intellectually. I am as intellectually a barbarian as it gets. So I am, I guess, judging the Western canon harshly. And I get into it and I play with its forms, insert some interesting ideas, and see how those forms stand up and how those ideas stand up. So W.H. Auden, I've infected like a virus, the barbarian virus, put some perspective into it of the victims of our aggression. How wherever Arabs passionately wait the miracle of democracy, there always must be colonizers who don't want it to especially happen, creating disarming bombs at the edge of their Zion. That's the religious fundamentalists who believe that. That Zion over there. So much of the rhetoric for us going into Iraq was hinged on the Christian ends of times rhetoric about we're strong Jewish partners and they're the chosen ones and this is going to bring about the end of times. It's amazing how you can have millions of people die from such stupid excuses. They never forgot that even the dreadful martyrdom must run its course. Now that is straight from the poem. I didn't even change that line. It fits so well. Somewhere in the desert, someone's country, where invasions precede puppet regimes and torture houses set up innocently behind classrooms. That is from an unembedded reporter. If you look at, you could probably just Google that. Here, I'll look that up to show you how you can fact check this stuff. Iraq classroom torture house. And these things usually are tied back into our intelligence agencies. Our military doesn't do shit like this. Our military, for the most part, culturally, sometimes guys act stupid because it's been condoned from the top down. But it takes our intelligence services to really fucking be the assholes. Thousands of Iraqi women arrested and tortured, says Human Rights Watch. When was this? Was this recent? I haven't even... 2014. So I stopped paying attention so much to Iraq after 2008-9. I went on to live my life and try to keep forming my personality as a human being who is capable of love, and this was becoming too heavy. But now I think I'm a little bit more resilient. I keep telling myself, if I could deal with heroin, I could deal with a lot of this shit. Iraq authorities, well, if I could deal with love, that's what, not even the opiates, but like strong relationships in your life. A couple of the fucking badass women I've been with had the ability to destroy me, so dealing with that, there's one still on my mind that that's why I'm on this Tinder thing. I know that the best thing for me to get over someone is to just find a distraction. You need to, sometimes as a guy, if you're dealing with a little bit of heartbreak, you need to have like that rebound, just like remind yourself that you're good at what you do, like after making love, having sex, however you want to call it, but after doing it for so many times in your life, you get a certain confidence in that, a certain confidence in the pursuit. And so I know getting a little female attention will make me feel better at this point in my life, but she's heavy on my mind. So Iraq authorities are illegally detaining thousands of women, many of whom are subjected to torture and ill treatment, including the threat of sexual abuse, Human Rights Watch said Thursday. They included statements from woman who said officers obtained a confession of terrorism from her by threatening to rape her teenage daughter. 7 months after speaking to Human Rights Watch, the woman was executed. So this is the civilization we brought to Iraq. I haven't even looked into it. This is why you need a Truth and Reconciliation Committee. But anyways, that line in the poem was from a torture house which was found behind a classroom, and it was in one of the books I read. But if I look into this, I'm just going to bum myself out some more. That's why we need that space for that discussion, because that discussion is going to be a heavy discussion. And a lot of emotions are going to come up, and we need a safe. We talk about safe spaces and triggers as a way to keep people from becoming emotional. You just want a place for people to process those emotions. You don't want to live through life sheltered and padded from emotions. But when they come up, it takes a minute to process them. It's just like I'm dealing with a little bit of heartbreak. You need to allow things to run their course, and some wisdom and some clinical professionals to help people process these emotions. I'm processing them myself. I am my own professional. Seems to be how I've lived my life on my own authority. So, innocently behind classrooms. In America's Iraq, for instance, how everyone turns quite leisurely from the disaster. Is that what we've done as a society? We've turned quite leisurely from the disaster in Iraq. If you ask the average person on the street, they don't even know we're still in Iraq and Afghanistan. They thought how quickly our attention spans change. And why blame the victims? We're constantly being stimulated with these narratives to change our attention span. And this is where we hold our political leaders accountable. How much is it the president or the main leader's responsibility to keep our attention spans on what we should be paying attention to? So Barack Obama and Joe Biden and their Biden bro memes of their friendship, how much does that occupy our mental space? And how little does. That's what his disposition matrix is supposed to keep the war out of the news, by killing these people with drones, so that way we're not having American troops die, because that is always bad press. And so they've instituted ways to execute the supposed war on terror. Oh, that's another thing. Why do you use the terms of the people who came before you? War on terror is a bullshit term. We keep losing these war on nouns. We've lost the one on drugs. That is not linguistically a sound statement, war on terror. So if Barack Obama uses it, it shows you what his values are. One of manipulation and linguistic confusion. But quite leisurely from the disaster. The foreigner may have heard the explosion, the mother's cry, but for him it's not an important failure. The sun shines as it has to on the camouflage disappearing into the green zone. So in his poem he put green water, so that fit almost too perfectly. Camouflage disappearing into the green zone. You hear an explosion, a suicide bomber. Every single corner, every single street corner in Iraq has experienced at least one incident of violence, whether a bomb or a shooting or a stabbing or a rape or a kidnapping. I need to find that statistic, but I read it and I'll never forget it, because I really want to put that metaphor onto New York City. Imagine if every single street corner in New York City experienced an act of violence. It would make the war a lot more real for you. That should be a moving art piece where you have the city of Baghdad and you have a miniature version in a warehouse, and you have just to let people visually see the scale of violence, like when in Vietnam they had kids climbing into the gunner pits of the helicopters and they could pretend like they were strafing Vietnamese villages. That was an actual a model set up, and it was unironic. It was set up to actually let these kids imagine they were in Vietnam strafing villagers until people complained. But that was set up by this pro-war side unironically to let kids act out committing war crimes, strafing innocent people in villages. So this one would be ironic, but that would be a very good art installation to do a scale model of Baghdad, just to show the scale of violence and also the partitions and how I found a map that actually goes through how intermixed it was, Shiite and Sunnite, and since we've been in there, how we pretty much balkanized the city in preparation for an eventual tripart division of the country, which was the end goal, which people have been saying for a while. If you look at the higher levels, their narratives, they have so many people involved in the bureaucracy of managing empire that their narratives leak out to the mainstream. All of it can't be managed in secret conspiracies. So if you look at the mainstream narratives from the top of empire, you'll see them slowly but steadily planning out their next moves, which is why they're going to be defeated, because their values are inhuman, and it's an older way to execute strategy. Which is why I call my new political party, our new political party hopefully, but Flash Politics. Our strengths are our speed of execution and our human values. But that's a whole nother discussion. Um, the sun shines as it has to on the camouflage disappearing into the green zone, and the expensive delicate convoys must have heard something amazing, a boy falling into the sky. I got that image from Timothy O'Brien. The things they carry is someone steps on a landmine in Vietnam, and instead of describing the violence, he describes it as the spiritual act of someone being taken up into the sky, but you're being blown apart. But they have somewhere to get to and still sail calmly by. You ignore the chaos around you that your government is committing within your name. Especially if you're a private contractor. If you're a soldier, you're being paid shit. And I wonder, do the private contractors in Iraq have as high a suicide rate as our soldiers? Because they get paid sometimes like at least 100, 150,000. When I first got out, I actually looked into contracting in Iraq because I had a top secret security clearance. If I had learned Arabic, I definitely could have gone over there and been a translator. And you make $150,000 tax-free money, plus all your expenses are paid for. Whereas, so those are the numbers I was looking at. I was looking at $150,000 if I had learned some more skills because I had a top secret clearance and I had military experience. This is, if I was more cynical, I might have followed that path. And as a soldier, I was making about 14,000, so 10 times more money as a private contractor, and you don't have to follow the rules of engagement. You have less accountability. So if you want to talk about injustices against the soldiers, that's a huge one. That they're being their security is undermined by these guys being paid 10 times more than them. But that's just, I think, a little disrespectful. Regardless of what you think about the military empire, our soldiers should get paid more and be treated better. That's pretty obvious. So that's where you find out where people's values are, is if you really support the troops, and let's pay them more and pay private contractors less. But that's Karl Rove had a really great political mind, and the human values of a cesspool, of course, but his political mind, he knew wedge issues. He knew how to find an issue that would fracture a political base. And that's a really good wedge issue to fracture Trump's political base. He claims he supports the troops, but his actions actually undermine their payment. The VA is going to shit right now because it's allowing some cronies to get in there and give them a bunch of bad advice. And he's in deep with that Blackwater family. So I'm sure money's being doled out to private contractors at a historic pace. So if you wanted to really support troops, give them more money and give them more benefits. Just follow through on those social contracts and take them out of harm's way when it's not a noble cause that they've sworn to defend. You sworn to defend. You swear to defend the Constitution against enemies, foreign and domestic. That's as simple as it gets. Let's talk about values in the Constitution. Let's talk about enemies, foreign and domestic. And I think that will get the military on whatever side of the honest discussion. To Allah we belong, and to Him is our return. This is my way to try to understand people who don't join the insurgency and who are able to live in Iraq without becoming violent despite how much suffering their country is going through. Those people I respect, because those people I think I identify with the most. If I lived in Iraq and I was Iraqi, I would like to imagine that I would be able to retain my humanity and suffer whatever I'm going through with dignity. It's a very fucking hard thing to do, I can imagine. So let us at least give those people credit who are able to withstand this, because they're going to be the bedrock of a society if we're able to actually unwind this disaster. We're going to need some rational people in there to try to help rebuild their country, if we don't kill them all, right?